Good morning. Today we're going to speak about the Isser, the Iraisa, to eat Chodesh. Chodesh means grain that grew after Pesach. And the Torah tells us in Parshas Emor that we're not allowed to eat any grain in any form before the Korban Ha'omer is brought. You know, on the second day of Pesach, first day of Chol Hamoed, the day we start counting Sfiras Ha'omer from this Korban. The Mishnah describes that the Yidden would gather before Pesach and go cut barley. Barley was the first grain to ripen. They would go cut barley before Pesach, and there was a whole process through which they cut the grain, because, as we know, the pasuk tells us to start counting Sfiras Ha'omer mimochras Shabbos, which some understood as meaning Sunday. Mochras Shabbos, the day after Shabbos, is Sunday, and the Tzdukim believed that we start counting Sfiras Ha'omer we always start counting on a Sunday. And in order to disprove them, the Chachamim made a whole show out of cutting the Korban Ha'omer and bringing it on the first day of Pesach. Mochras Shabbos is understood as being the day after Pesach, after the first day of Pesach, first day of Chol Hamoed, and not being on a Sunday. So then they would bring this Korban. It was a Korban mincha that they brought. And then we start counting Sfiras Ha'omer from then. Torah says, besides we're counting Sfira from the first day of Chol Hamoed, we're also not allowed to eat any grain that year, that season, until the Korban Ha'omer is brought. This mitzvah, says the Torah, is b'chol mishvei seichem. It's chukas olam l'doirei seichem. This mitzvah is for all times, not just in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and b'chol mishvei seichem in all places, which we'll get to in a moment. The first hurdle we need to overcome is, if there's no Korban Ha'omer, there's no Beis Hamikdash, when are we allowed to start eating the new grain if the Korban was never brought? So we have a Mishnah that tells us that Rabbi Yochanan Mitzake made a takana. One of his takanas was, in memory of Beis Hamikdash, is that the entire second day of Pesach, the entire first day of Chol Hamoed you're still not allowed to eat the grain because there's no Korban. But after the day has passed, then you can start eating the new grain, even though there's no Korban. And in Chutz La'aretz, where we keep 2 days of Yom Tiv, so we keep an extra day, we are not allowed to eat the new grain until technically the third day of Pesach. So that's the Isser Min HaTorah, to eat any new grain every single year until Pesach. In Eretz Yisrael, this is generally not a problem because of the way the seasons are. Most grain, at least on a conventional year, most grain is planted in the beginning of the winter, and it's usually picked somewhere around Pesach. In springtime, it's picked and then it's dried out and eaten. So generally, if grain is planted throughout the winter, comes Pesach, and that's all fine. Most of the grain of that market could easily be eaten. Problem is, when Yidden move to colder climates, end up in Europe or even further in Russia and very cold places, there was no planting. You couldn't plant grain throughout the winter. Planting only began after Pesach. So if you start or around Pesach time. So if the grain is planted after Pesach or within machlokes of 2 weeks before Pesach or 3 days before Pesach, if it's planted after that time, then technically you need to wait an entire year to eat the new grain, and then you're stuck. You have nothing to eat. So there are two questions that need to be answered before we start understanding how we eat grain after Pesach. First question is, does Chadash apply in Chutz La'aretz? Is this just a mitzvah that applies to Eretz Yisrael, like all other agricultural mitzvahs? Or does this mitzvah apply also to Chutz La'aretz? So we have a Mishnah in Maseches Kiddushin. Mishnah tells us that any mitzvah that is dependent on an agricultural mitzvah that's dependent on the land only applies in Eretz Yisrael. If it's not agricultural, it's a mitzvah that applies to a person and his duties with his produce, then it would apply also to Chutz La'aretz. Besides for two things, Arla and Kilayim. Arla, these are two mitzvahs that are agricultural, but they apply everywhere. So according to the Tanakama, Chodesh is not mentioned. Chodesh would not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Chodesh only applies. Chodesh would not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Only Arla and Kilayim. Comes Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Af HaChodesh. Even Chodesh is another agricultural mitzvah, which technically should only be in Eretz Yisrael, but even Chodesh is extended to apply throughout the world. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, Chodesh is Asur Min HaTorah in Chutz La'aretz. We have a machlokes, the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer. Who do we follow? So that's why we have another Mishnah in Maseches Arla. We know whenever we have a machlokes in a Mishnah, and then you have a Mishnah that is a stam Mishnah, which means it has no author and there's no machlokes about it. It's just a simple din. That is the halacha that we follow. So Mishnah in Arla tells us that the Chodesh Asur Min HaTorah b'chol makom. Chodesh is Asur everywhere at all times. Chodesh is Asur. So that would seem to tell us that even in Chutz La'aretz, Chodesh is Asur Min HaTorah. Next question we need to address is, what about grain that belongs to a non-Jew? If grain belongs to a non-Jew, does the Isser of Chodesh apply? We can go buy flour in the market from a non-Jewish company, and Chodesh would not apply to it. So here too we have a machlokes. According to most opinions, according to Tosfos, Chodesh applies even to grain of a non-Jew. According to the Bach, the Maharil, and a select few Rishonim and Achronim, Chodesh, grain that belongs to a non-Jew, is not Asur Min HaTorah. You're allowed to eat grain that belongs to a non-Jew. Let's just skip to the Alter Rebbe for a second, or Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, all go through all of these different scenarios of all these different reasons why we should be able to be lenient and eat grain that belongs to a non-Jew in Chutz La'aretz. That's Chodesh. Alter Rebbe says, halacha is that even though there's room to be mekel, but a person, because this is an Isser D'Oraisa, and there's only a select few that hold that does not apply to a non-Jewish grain, it's advisable that everyone should be machmir and only eat yashon, not eat chadash, in Eretz Yisrael, in Chutz La'aretz at all times, because we're dealing with a Isser D'Oraisa, which Sfeikei l'chumra, and we should all be machmir. The fact is, and at least I'll tell you what the Rebbe said 40 years ago. Today it's a little bit different. But 40 years ago, the Rebbe made a comment that I don't know one Jew in the entire New York, entire Brooklyn, even in Williamsburg. This is what the Rebbe said. Even in Williamsburg, I don't know of a Jew that is machmer not to eat chadash. No, it doesn't. Nowadays, we see it's starting to He printed out the packages Yashan, and it's a new chumrah that people are the firm companies are all getting into.
And you all learned about it from Astracher cookies.
It started. So this is all within the last 40 years, because 40 years ago, Tafshid Mem never made this comment that no one's doing. It was unheard of. It was totally unheard of.
Is it that very often when you're buying
Okay, so there's a concept brought in halacha about a sveka. One of the reasons to be mekel is that you have when this is only applies to stam tefua. When you don't know if this grain is yashin or chadash, you don't know where it's from. You're going to the supermarket buying grain. You can rely on a sveka. You have one suffix if it's chadash or yashin, maybe it was planted before Pesach. And you have a second suffix even if it is chadash, maybe it's from last year. Even if it grew after Pesach, maybe it's from the year before, because everything's stockpiled and there's all sorts of
nowadays you have these huge granaries that
so there's reason to say, especially when there's importing and exporting, you have no idea where grain's coming from.
No. It's like if you're the US, the grain came from the US. I'm pretty sure of that.
no, but it sits in these silos for
No. In Europe, they had this suffix. There were areas where there was no import export, so they couldn't rely on this faker that it came from somewhere else. But when the borders were open and there was commerce going back and forth, you were able to rely that maybe this is from somewhere else, if that was common practice.
Just so the people that said that you couldn't, which meant that if you got the grain, you had to keep it in your basin for a year before you could use it, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Then
you have to wait till
issue of rodents and mice and
Yep.
whatever.
and especially when people were struggling for food. So the Alter Rebbe does start off the halach and tells us clearly that achshav ein ha'olam nizharim b'chadash. People are not. The fact is, even time the Alter Rebbe, most people are not concerned with chadash, which is fascinating, because you're talking about an Isuday Raisa that is absolute. There's nothing, a clear pasuk telling us not to eat chadash. And yet, ein ha'ilam nizharim, yes, the Alter Rebbe goes through all the reasons why people are trying to be making, but the Alter Rebbe still says it's not. These reasons are not good enough. So today's coming back in style, and you have there's even a website now. You can go on to yashan.com, and they will go through every granary and every King Arthur and every batch number on the King Arthur flour that's going to be yashan or going to be chadash, and they research, the whole organization researching all sorts of grains and which ones are chadash, which ones are yashan. But the fact is, till this recent revolution or reintroduction of this chumrah, no one did it. No one cared for it. The main source to be mekel is the Bach. The Bach, who said that we can go according to the opinion that chadash of a goy, it belongs to a goy, it's not asur d'oraisa. And the Bach goes through the tshuva from the Rush. The Bach goes through a whole thing, and he becomes the das yachid, basically, to say that chadash does not apply to non-Jewish grain, which would still mean that a Jewish farmer in Europe who had a field and was growing grain still had a problem. The Alter Rebbe brings the Bach, everyone brings the Bach and says, still, we have a das yachid versus the consensus of most major poskim who say that Kaddish is a problem. You shouldn't follow the Bach, and we should all be machzor. The Gra went to the extent of saying that the Bach was wrong. Bach made a clear mistake. It's clear that he made a mistake and he's wrong, and there's no room to be mekel. You need to be machmer and only eat yashin. Tzemach Tzedek as well had a few tshuvas where he goes through all these things, and he also totally disregards the Bach, and says there's no reason to follow the Bach, and people should be machmir. Yet, there's two shuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek. Before we get there, Tzemach Tzedek himself ended up writing a shtar mechira. Same way we have a shtar mechira for chametz. You sell your chametz to a guy so you don't own it over Pesach. Tzemach Tzedek wrote up a shtar mechira for farmers to sell either the grain or the field to a guy in a similar fashion to how we sell chametz. Then now the field belongs to a guy, and all the produce that I'm picking, I'm buying it from the guy. And then you have a shtar mechira, and then now you're able to eat your grain. So on one hand, he's taking it very seriously. He's writing a shtar mechira, and it's clear in his chuvas that he's against the Bach, or conceptually against this idea of the Bach, that chodesh of a guy is mutter. I'll tell you, the Tzemach Tzedek is taking a very strict stance. What? So there's two different ways. Either you're selling the land, and I think that there were different sales that went on. Either you're selling the land or you're selling the grain. And I guess that would depend if you had it before or not. So the Tzemach Tzedek opened up a whole colony of agricultural land in Shedrin. It's a famous Hasidic colony. That Tzemach Tzedek was involved in buying the land and getting it from the government and settling Hasidim in a way that they should have income. They should be self-sufficient. And he set up these colonies. So that's when his Hasidim came to him with these problems. And that's when he came up with the Shtar Mechira. Where is it? I don't know. It's not. I'm saying it can't be too far from Lubavitch. Yeah, but where is it? 50. And then there's another chassid of Tzemach Tzedek, and here's where things take a totally drastic turn. A chassid of Tzemach Tzedek who was a moyel, who used to travel around doing brisson, and he himself was very machmer not to eat chadash. And he wrote to the Tzemach Tzedek, he has a problem. He's traveling through Poland, doing brisson in Poland, and no one cares at all about chadash. What should he do? He's machmer, but he's going through Poland, and Poland was full of chassidim, and no one's machmer on chadash. What should he do? So the Tzemach Tzedek told him that in Poland, the Chassidim, and we'll see where this comes from in a minute, general Chassidim follow this idea that the Bach was a das yachid, but the Bach, before he passed away, Gehenim, the fires went off for 60 days. Different Chassidim in different, every Rebbe had his version of the story, but they're all the same idea. One says 30 days, one says 40 days. Tzemach Tzedek writes 60 days. For 60 days before the Bach passed away, the fires of Gehenna went off. To cool down, every tzaddik needs to go through Gehenna. The fires cooled down for the Bach, and the idea was because of his heter of Chadash, because he was matir Chadash, everything changed for him. Chassidim have this, also another Chassidic legend, so to say, that Baal Shem Tov was machmer on Chadash, obviously, in the beginning. Then he had a dream where it was practically impossible in some areas to keep Chadash, especially in Poland. Alter Rebbe writes about Poland, all the beer. Alter Rebbe writes the main drink was beer, and all the beer is Chadash. So they had to be makel on it. Baal Shem Tov asked in a dream, what should he do about Chadash? Baal Shem Tov was told in a dream that we're semich on the Bach, and were Mekel and Chadash. From then, Baal Shem Tov turned, and at least for the public, he was Mekel and Chadash. And we see in that generation, between the times of the Baal Shem Tov and the Tzemach Tzedek, in those few generations, there was a radical shift amongst Chassidim who followed the Baal Shem Tov from being Machmer on Chadash to being Mekel on Chadash. Even though we know that I think the Rebbe Rashab himself was Machmer on Chadash, and there were Chassidim and the Rebbes who personally were very Machmer, but publicly, in terms of how they taught and what they told people to do, was a very, very strong push to be Mekel on Chadash according to the Bach. And the Bach is this Das Yachid, but he and also it's brought down that the Bach was the Rav. Bach was the Rav in Mezhebush. At a certain point, he moved to Mezhebush. He was the Rav in Mezhebush. Baal Shem Tov said that the Bach is the Mara de Asra. He's the Rav of Mezhebush, and if he's Mekel on Chadash, we have to accept his psak, and we have to allow Chadash. So you see this fascinating thing where you have an Issur D'Oraisa, which, for all practical, technical, halachic purposes, there's no reason in the world to be Mekel. As the Alter Rebbe himself makes clear, the Gra makes clear, Tzemach Tzedek makes clear, everyone makes clear that the Bach is not to be regarded halachically. In classic halachic Mesorah, we should not follow the Bach. He's a one-off, he's a one-man opinion that says that Chodesh is allowed, Chodesh of a Goy is allowed. And then you have this Chassidic phenomenon, this spiritual idea where you have the Baal Shem Tov, his dream about the Bach, and you have the Tzemach Tzedek responding to his chassid about the Bach, and everything changes. So you have halacha, clear-cut halacha, and then you have this, Kabbalistic or spiritual Chassidic influence that is changing everything.
All the other, like from all the other halachic stuff from the fields and as well.
Only not Yisrael.
It's also only for Yidden, not for Bay.
Yeah.
It's not like the made up theory of Bay.
No, but those only apply in Eretz Yisrael. They don't apply in Chutz La'aretz.
Right, but in a guy in Eretz Yisrael is the same reality. Like the whole Goyish thing is a very good shortcut. It solves you all these problems. Like it works by Truman.
I don't think it works in Eretz Yisrael by Truma Meiser. No, you're not allowed. I think you're not allowed to sell land to a guy in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, but if he does own it, that's bad. You're not supposed to, but.
Say you can't have a shtar mechira in Eretz Yisrael.
But the fact is, if a guy does Shmita always no, why not? A
guy is allowed to.
No.
I don't think in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz
You're
Yisrael,
supposed to.
no, but in Eretz Yisrael, I think Shmita applies to everything.
Anyway, we're getting you off script.
No, what I'm trying to say is that if a guy owns the thing, it's a very good shortcut to get around this whole issue.
True, but in Eretz Yisrael, it's practically impossible, and those only apply in Eretz Yisrael. This is something that applies out of Eretz Yisrael. One of the only Yisraelim that applies out of Eretz Yisrael. That's where you have this.
So if it's like Kalayim and Arlo, then it doesn't matter if it's a guy or not.
Right.
So unlike everything else where normally it would, if it applies everywhere else, that means it also applies to them.
Right.
Because the Arlo and Umuzay.
Correct. So, and this was kind of a secret legend throughout the generations. You had Chassidim and the Rebbes who themselves personally were very machmer. And even in times of in Rabbi Chitrik, who lived in Karais, or Elter Chassid lived in Karais, where the Rebbe had him recording stories from his youth. He writes that when he was a bacher, he came home to a city, and he sees that all the peasants, the farmers were all coming to the Rav to write a shtar mechira for them, and he was shocked. How is this possible? How are you writing a shtar mechira? The Bach is a das yachid. We don't follow the Bach. How is this possible? He came back and he went to a Chassidish Rav, who I think I just asked Rabbi Khan. He said it's Rabbi Khan's father's cousin, who told him that he was originally a Rav back in Shadrin, and he heard from the Chassidim when the Tzemach Tzedek established this area. He wrote the Shtar Mechira for them. He wrote this whole concept, and then it slowly spread. By Chassidim, throughout all different Chassidim, they all quote the story of the Baal Shem Tov in different ways. They all have this idea of Gehenim being cooled off for 30, 40, 50, 60 days, whatever it was. And it's all attributed back to this idea of the Bach being Mater Chodesh. Because what happened? Torah basically created an impossibility for Yidden to survive. This halacha of Chodesh, to keep Chodesh in Europe, to keep this Chumrah, or this Isudai Raisa, not a Chumrah, cut off a necessary staple of everyone's lives.
They'll move to Europe.
There.
You have Yidden living there for hundreds, almost 1,000 years.
Before they moved there.
And it was a practical impossibility. So Yidden are sitting and eating Chadash.
Got no choice.
They got no choice. It's not really discussed in the beginning. Right? But in the beginning, no one discusses it. It was just, everyone just did it. It was forgotten, like a forgotten mitzvah. Came along the Bach, and there was, I think this is the way we have to look at it. Comes along the Bach, and the Bach basically created a way, a heter, a way to judge all the Yidden for hundreds of years who were eating Chadash, and to not hold them accountable for this Isser. And that was seen by the Baal Shem Tov, that was seen as a huge accomplishment. The biggest Avos Yisrael could possibly have is to take an Isser D'Oraisa that everyone is seemingly transgressing, and turn it around and say that they are perfectly in line with halacha. For hundreds of years, millions and millions of Yidden were sitting and eating, drinking beer, eating bread all day, every single day of the year. They were all being over on this. Isser, the Bach came and cleared it up for them. To the extent where there were some, the Alter Rebbe was even asked this question. When it comes to matzah, and this is people who were obviously somehow being machmer on Chadash, means that they had to stockpile grain. Everything they ate was a year old. They had a question. They needed to bake matzah, and their previous year's supply was over. Now it's time to bake matzah, and they're only left with Chadash. So now you enter a double whammy. If you're gonna eat Chadash, now it's a mitzvah bab avera. You want to make matzah out of Chadash, you want to do a mitzvah by eating an avera. Alter Rebbe has a whole tshuva how he allows it for this case. Other poskim adrabah, even today, poskim writes that even those who don't care about Chadash and they disregard and they follow the Bach, whatever. Definitely, when it comes to matzah's mitzvah, when you want to eat matzah and Pesach, you should definitely be careful. Should only be yash. Alter Rebbe, now everyone has the ability. I mean, if you want to, now it's so. I don't know. Practically, like we on one hand we have a very strong stream from the Baal Shem Tov, from in Chassidic legacy, from all different types of Chassidim. To follow, to not worry about it, to follow the Bach. To the extent that the Rebbe made this comment just literally 40 years ago. Now it's on every wrapper you look at. But 40 years ago, this did not exist anywhere. The Rebbe says, even in Williamsburg, can't find the Jew who's doing it. And if you find the Jew, the Rebbe says, Tavei ala bracha. Now when we do have this, I don't know, easy access to keep this mitzvah, go figure. Go figure. So I think this is just it's a fascinating sugya where you see a Isser D'Oraisa that there really is all the poskim that everyone buckled down very hard on this Isser D'Oraisa not to be mekel, and yet you have a practical reality where no one's doing it, and comes along this Chassidic idea that kind of smooths everything out for us. Just thought that was an interesting sugya.
So otherwise, every cereal company now, every hashkafa, OU, okay.
Every piece of grain you have is a problem.
Matzah and Chadash are done for the mitzvahs